Welcome to Revelation BIB 406, Lecture 11. I want to begin the lecture by doing a quick review of the previous chapter, chapter 12, and then we'll jump into chapter 13 in today's lecture. Before we jump into a study of chapter 13, I want to take a moment and talk about covenants in the scripture, and I'm going to put a link up on Populi that will take you to information that will be perhaps better for you to read through and kind of understand to an even further degree what I'm talking about. But covenants in the Old Testament, they were really shaped by the culture of that time and would have resembled what is called a suzerainty treaty. And the way that I would explain this is, in Old Testament time frame, in the customs of that day, you would find individuals that were called a suzerain. And a suzerain would basically be a wealthy individual who would have property, livestock, and would be independently wealthy. So the suzerain was established, and then other individuals who were not wealthy and who did not have a means of making a living, maybe they didn't have land or livestock and were dependent upon others, they would go and they would find a suzerain, and a suzerain would make a treaty with them. And basically the treaty would be these terms. The suzerain would say, look, you can live on my land and you can work with my livestock. I will feed you. I will give you a place to live, but you will be subject to me. And whatever the terms of that agreement would be drawn up between the suzerain and the individual who was dependent upon the suzerain. And so that was called a suzerain treaty. And it would normally be some type of something symbolic that would be a ceremony or something that would happen to where both individuals, the suzerain and the person dependent upon the suzerain, they would be able to take something back with them to commemorate the agreement between them. So you have suzerainty treaties, and the Old Testament covenant is in many ways symbolic of that suzerainty treaty. It's also similar to the Hittite treaties, which in the Hittite treaty you have same type of example. You would have the wealthy individual making a treaty with the less wealthy individual, and there would be something to symbolize that. In these treaties, it would be very common for an animal to be sacrificed and for the carcass of the animal to be split in two, and then the suzerain and the individual joining the suzerain in the treaty would walk between the carcass of that animal. And in a way, it symbolized the fact that if the terms of the agreement, the terms of the treaty were ever broken, then that animal being sacrificed and walking between the divided carcass would symbolize the death or punishment that would come about for the individual who broke the treaty. So this is seen in the Old Testament where you have Abraham walking, or in the story in the Old Testament you have Abraham who sacrifices an animal, splits the carcass, but then God himself walks through the divided carcass without Abraham, God himself representing the suzerain and taking all of the terms of the treaty upon himself, that Abraham did not even participate in the walking through the divided carcass because God was going to take all of the different elements of the treaty. He was going to accomplish all of that himself without Abraham being involved in that. So you've got the Old Testament parallel, though, and that's going to come into place here in Revelation 13, and we'll talk about that in the tie-in to how these treaties are represented here in Revelation. But that's a picture of God's covenant with Israel, the way that these Old Testament treaties were made. That's the same fashion in which God made this covenant with Israel in the Old Testament. So I wanted to make a tie in there, and I'll make the connection to how that applies to our text here in Revelation shortly. All right, so a review of chapter 12. First of all, we said that chapters 12 through 14 are all parenthetical. So all of the information in chapters 12, 13, and 14 are going to be given sort of happening circumstances that are going on at the same time as the events of Revelation chapter 11. So this is all nothing new in terms of the chronology of time is happening here. This is all just extra information we're getting, and our timeline has stopped at chapter 11 for right now. In chapter 12, we looked at the major characters, and I would want you to just rehearse in your mind, see if you can think through who those major characters were, and then also what did each character represent, or who, rather, did each character represent. And if you don't know the answer to those questions, if they're not in your notes, then go back and catch the previous lecture 10, and you want to make sure that you are familiar with the major characters and then who each character represents. We also said that chapter 12 is considered to be the most blank of all chapters in Revelation, and the answer you're looking for there is symbolic. That is the most symbolic of all the various chapters in Revelation. Okay, so let's look through chapter 13 and go through some commentary on this. I'll start reading in verse 1. It says, "I stood upon the sand of the sea and saw a beast rise up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his horns 10 crowns, and upon his heads the name of blasphemy. And the beast which I saw was likened to a leopard, and his feet were as the feet of a bear, and his mouth as the mouth of a lion. And the dragon gave him his power and his seat and great authority." All right, so there are going to be 2 different beasts talked about in this chapter. The first one we just read about. The second one is down in verse 11. It says, "I beheld another beast coming up out of the earth, and he had 2 horns like a lamb, and he spake as a dragon." All right, so 2 beasts. The first one is going to be a picture of both the revived Roman Empire, and then most specifically, he will be seen as the Antichrist. He is given power, we read in verse 2, by the dragon, which we know from the previous chapter, the dragon is representative of Satan. So Satan gives him his power. And the first beast is characterized by 3 different animals. These animals would represent different world powers. So you'll see here the leopard, the bear, and the lion. The leopard would represent the Alexandrian Empire, the bear, the Medes and Persians, and then the lion, Babylon, or the Babylonian Empire. All right, so the second beast in verse 11 is most likely a reference to the leader of the false church during the tribulation. There are a couple things I will point out. One is that the first beast, the Antichrist, he is going to mimic in many ways the life of Christ. Again, he's the Antichrist, so he's going to mimic many of the things that Christ, the things that are revealed about Christ in Scripture. So one thing he mimics is his death and resurrection. In verse 3, "I saw one of his heads, as it were, wounded to death, and his deadly wound was healed, and all the world wondered after the beast. And they worshipped the dragon, which gave power unto the beast, and they worshipped the beast, saying, Who is like unto the beast? Who is able to make war with him? And then there was given unto him a mouth, speaking great things and blasphemies. And he has power to continue for 40 and 2 months. This will be seen as the last 3.5 years of the tribulation, either in a historic premillennial model or in a dispensational model. This would cover the last 3.5 years of the tribulation that's taking place on earth. All right, you also have this second beast who is, again, the leader of this false church, some type of an organized state religion that is put together, and everyone is made to worship in this manner and worship the beast. So that is clear as well. A couple other things worthy of note would be that in verse 8, the book of life is mentioned. There's clear insight to the fact that the names of the saved have been written there. since the foundation of the world. Verse 8 talks about that. The second beast is also referred to as a prophet or a false prophet. He performs signs and false miracles. And in verse 15, he is responsible for the construction of an image that is made. It's a likeness of the first beast, the Antichrist, which is used in worship. And everyone is required to worship the image. It's almost a reference back to like a King Nebuchadnezzar and the image that he built and had everyone worship and bow down to it in the Old Testament. If you think of the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace, they didn't bow down. Very similar type of situation here. The false prophet has this image made of the Antichrist, the first beast, and everyone is commanded to worship the Antichrist.